a tapestry of amazing topics and maintains several great sections on everything from archons to Zion. I'm psyched to have him here to walk us down another winding path of realization, examining the odd breadcrumbs we find along the way. The man who knows the plan, the Hansel to my Gretel, Gordon White. How the hell are you?
Fantastic, Greg. Always a pleasure to either listen or to speak.
Yeah, man, I'm so glad we could do this again. We've been kind of emailing back and forth about some of these pieces of the puzzle, like the mysteriousness of DNA and panspermia, ancient aliens and bloodlines and all that crazy stuff. And in a conspiracy subculture of many thoughts and theories, it's kind of hard to know where to put our attention sometimes, but it's also kind of tough to find the beginning of the story here. But I guess if we were to kick this off by talking about human antiquity and ancient civilizations to try to get some noteworthy insights into the human story, where do you think we would look first?
If we're talking about the human story rather than life on Earth, there's a couple of things that have emerged from, say, maybe the last 15 years of genetic research that are more interesting than I think alternate history has realized. And this is to do with the genetic evidence of our migration out of Africa about 70,000 years ago. Now, the reason alternate history tends to dismiss this is they're like, oh, yes, but we've got things that are older. So, which is true. There's a 200,000-year-old fire pit in Britain and another one in sort of North Israel that have been found. And inevitably, the problem I perceive it is a lot of alternate history theorists have a specific worldview that they're looking for documentary evidence to support. And in the meantime, they're missing quite an interesting trick. And the interesting trick is this, the sort of Out of Africa project, so the Mitochondrial Eve project, says a lot about the human journey, but says nothing about our origins. So we can know with some degree of confidence that everyone who is alive outside of Africa today, who isn't a recent migrant out of Africa, is descended from a single female of about a time depth of about 90,000 years ago in the middle of Africa, and then we left about 70,000 years ago. Now, the thing is that may not have been, and I've actually spoken to the geneticists at Oxford who are involved in this project. Their exact words were, it's quite clear humans weren't the only game in town, and this particular journey wasn't the only game in town. So it's kind of one of those weird logic traps where we're alive today because our ancestors survived. So if there were earlier migrations out of Africa, for instance, and everybody died, how would they show up in our blood?
Yeah.
So that's the sort of explanation or the interpretation on the scientific side for why you can find artifacts and sites that fall outside this kind of 70,000 year sweep, which is good. So it kind of gives us two things. It gives us what I think is a very beautiful kind of kumbaya, boom diada, love the whole world kind of story about the people who are here and we're kind of on this journey, which is great. But it also gives us an opportunity to frame some of the other anomalous archaeological sites we find without kind of going, well, it's aliens, called it, definitely aliens, close the book.
Yeah, that's actually a great point, because that is such a gray area for me, an area of a lot of confusion, is listening to some of these alternative guys, finding these sites that seem anomalous to the human story. But then, yeah, of course, the only real explanation is, well, there were some aliens at some point, some genetic engineers.
Yeah, on both sides. And so in this respect, sort of alternate theorists are as much to blame as mainstream scientists, because they both sort of pick their view of the world and go, well, this happened, and then try to shoehorn the data into it, whether or not it fits. Now, I mean, we've discussed this before, and I'm sure we'll get onto it, but I'm technically an interventionist. So I don't actually have a problem with the idea that the origins of life on Earth, I mean, neither did the guy who discovered DNA, Francis Crick. I don't have a problem with the idea that DNA is extraterrestrial in origin. That's called the Panspermia theory. But the idea that sort of 3,500 years ago, we were kind of smushed together by these very old beings on nuclear rocket ships. Well, that would show up. That would actually show up in our DNA, and also it kind of requires additional evidence to support that. And here's where I try to focus as much as possible on the data rather than the interpretation that comes out of quote unquote mainstream science, because I do think the origins of mankind and life on Earth are far from explained. But the way to definitively not explain it is to kind of go, oh, well, science is wrong equals Anunnaki.
I agree.
Yeah.
And that happens so much. Of course, when it comes to Sumeria, the only thing we really hear about the culture or the people is the whole Ancient Aliens Anunnaki saga. And I'm sure there's more we should probably be considering data-wise from them.
Well, yeah, so Sumeria is the perfect example of how you attract flying saucers like flies to garbage. The story of Sumeria's origins, 3500 BC, it just appears along the Tigris and Euphrates River. And they're writing like the devil is chasing them. You know, there's a sort of conventional explanation is unsatisfying. And it's unsatisfying to everyone. Like Carl Sagan himself said, if there was basically any evidence of extraterrestrial intervention on Earth, it would be at the beginning of Sumeria, because that is one giant question mark. Mm-hmm. Now, it is a giant question mark, and science is to blame for this by not actually looking at the more ambitious scientific evidence that is available, namely that we have genetic and morphological evidence that shows that some of the earlier or pre-Sumerian cultures like the Ubaid people have connections down to sort of South Asia and southern India, where, of course, you have Harappa and so on. So, but then they kind of have to, through their gritted teeth, end up saying, well, I guess we're talking about not necessarily a lost civilization, but all those stories which are there at the very beginning of Sumeria, of they're a child culture of somewhere else, have to be looked at with some degree of respect. So we're kind of caught in this infinite loop, which is by not looking at the legitimate archaeological and geological evidence that shows that Sumeria does indeed have antecedents. We ignore that, and then so people get to wondering and go, well, then clearly it was aliens.
Yeah, man, I'm so interested in that idea that humans wouldn't be the only game in town at this ancient point in history, but are we just talking about like Neanderthals and primitive?
Well, yeah, we are, but I wouldn't use the word just. I mean, you have in whatever it was, almost 10 years ago, the discovery of Homo fiorensis in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, which is the Hobbit.
Right.
So that animal shouldn't exist, right. And neither should the giants, which we have legends of that probably match, I suspect, cultural memories of other hominins. We seem to find about one every year and a half completely new species. So the more recent one was the Denisovans, and they had the highest level of genetic admixture between us and the Denisovans is again in Southeast Asia. So coming back to that human journey piece, when we left Africa 70,000 years ago, we basically turned right and jogged along the beach for a few thousand years and ended up in Australia and Southeast Asia in effectively an eye blink, like literally a couple of thousand years. Island Southeast Asia is particularly interesting from a kind of quote-unquote Atlantean theory perspective, because it's the part of the world that suffered the greatest amount of land loss at the end of the Ice Age. So an area twice the size of India went underwater there.
Wow.
So what we have is people living in conjunction with hobbits and Neanderthal and Denisovans and who knows what else in what is now a sunken continent. And it's from here, and from that sunken continent, we have genetic contact into Egypt, Sumeria, UAE, the Indus Valley, across to the Americas at a time depth of just before, or actually quite a bit before in some cases, but just before the end of the Ice Age. So you start to look at science and realize there are pieces of evidence that we need to fold back into our sort of folklore study that is the quote unquote search for lost civilizations, because these people didn't have streetlights or flying saucers, but they would have had a very sophisticated astronomy because they were open ocean navigators. They appear to have built step pyramids, as the evidence from Gunung Padang comes out. So you see kind of emerging from the scientific evidence a story that invites us to re-examine all these legends. That doesn't mean they're true, The thing about mythology and folklore is it's sort of like taking witness statements after a crime. You'll have about 5 or 6 different versions. The car was blue, the car was red, and you know something has happened. But you're dealing with a kind of not unreliable memory, but a memory that isn't built for the precise transfer of information, because that's not what mythology is about.
Well said. So how do we kind of reconcile that information? I mean, are we just to assume that we're the amalgamation of what's left of a bunch of interbreeding, like we're a mud of all these different things that once existed, or are we something different and that everything else just didn't survive the Ice Age?
Okay, so that's a couple of questions. We're not actually that admixed with other hominins. So, but crucially, and I think this is very important, we appear to have received a big chunk of our immune system, or the genes that correspond with it, from Neanderthal. So from basically, and wait for this, Neanderthal laying with the daughters of man gave us the immune system that probably enabled us to do things like cope with malaria and other things we would need for our kind of ongoing human journey. Now, whether that is specifically what is encoded in the kind of various giant and human angelish hybrids or human spirit hybrids around the world, whether that's what's encoded is a matter of interpretation. It probably isn't, or at least not consciously. But if you're talking about what humans are, this is where I find the discussion of kind of the alternate history view of human origins very frustrating, because we're sort of dealing with about 5 different things. So it's almost as if you came to visit me in London. I cook you this 5-course meal. There's sort of Devonian crab to start with. We have Welsh salt marsh lamb and Norfolk asparagus, and then we finish off with like Scottish raspberry cranachan. And as you walk in the door, I put the whole thing in a blender, turn it to mush, and then make you eat that mush with your hand. And that's what happens when people try to fold the origins of Sumeria and the origins of mankind and kind of memories of other hominins together into one thing. You're actually talking about 3 or 4 things over literally 1 million or so years. So in terms of the origin of humans, don't for a second think that this is in any way solved, like even in a conventional scientific sense. It just isn't. And to the point where if you go back a couple of million years, literally the best description or hypothesis as to what we are that I found is from a scientist called Dr. Eugene McCarthy, and he specializes in animal hybrids. I sort of wrote about this last year, but he's done 30 years of hybrid research on birds and mules. And our overfixation on looking for genetic evidence has kind of blinded scientists from looking at the obvious morphological evidence. And he basically says we're a pig-chimp hybrid.
Right.
And however weird that sounds, we have a whole bunch of morphological features that come from a pig. We're the only monkey without a penis bone, the carbohydrate makeup of our cells. There's all kinds of pieces that are like we have extra nipples, the surface fat, the kidney structure. Like he's right. So we have a bunch of pig pieces hybridized with a chimp, which he thinks is a chimpanzee, but I think is a bonobo. They're basically the same thing, except one of them is nice and the other one is a warmonger. And so the kind of scientific reaction to his research was sort of like, well, how does that happen? And then they're in some kind of creepy Animal Farm situation of saying essentially it would have to be a female chimp who mated with a wild pig, male, and raised their hybrid, and that hybrid back crossed with chimps. And that happened a bunch of times, and that's how we got there. Now, that's weird. That seems weird and unlikely.
Right.
And this is where we have to separate, and I don't think we're particularly good at it. This is where we have to separate the difference between data and interpretation. Dr. McCarthy's data are accurate. We have a pig problem we need to solve, which is that we're made partly of pig. Then it starts to get interesting, because if there are people who are sort of Sitchin fans out there, you go, wait a minute. So you're telling me humans are hybrids, like we've been built. That's another interpretation. Until we can demonstrate that pigs have sex with chimps, we're left with trying to solve this. So that's my way of that's my conciliatory concessionary card to the Sitchin types. You can make a case for something building humans, not at 3500 BC. We're talking at 2 million years ago. And if you make that case, to my mind, that is potentially as good as saying it's pigs having sex with chimps, which is, let me be clear, that's some science right now. That's really weird. And these are the pieces that we miss when we start talking about ginger Nephilims from South America are our overlords.
Wow, man. Yeah, well said. And I really love the things you have written on that. You have a great piece on dicks, and I really don't get to say that often.
Yeah.
But, in terms of the chimp bonobo thing, it's pretty fascinating because when you look at the size ratio between the body and the penis of primates and humans, and trying to determine which primates we might be from, there are some behavioral effects that relate to penis size that kind of play into this, right?
Yeah, for sure. It's a bit evolutionary psychology, so it's an interpretation, but I think it's valid, which is when you look at the sort of great apes, the ones that have harems, so the ones that have like a dominant male that keeps the other males away and then they just have sex with the females, have tiny penises. So the gorilla's appendix, and so on. When you get to the bonobo is it's a wonderful creature. I mean, they mourn their dead. They raise each other's children. They sing each other to sleep. They have orgies. So when chimpanzees meet each other, they have a fight. Bonobos have an orgy. They're like, okay, let's do this. It's on. And you find in that, and that's a male female sort of multiple partner sex species. And that's the closest we get to kind of a match to penis size and weight, as opposed to the chimpanzees, which are closer. Well, not too far away, not as far as, say, the gorilla. But there's a good case to be made that what we would hopefully consider our true behavior, which is kind of being generally nice and generally interested in sex, is a better match for the bonobo rather than the chimp kind of being a warlike cannibal. And to be fair, some days you can make that case as well.
Yeah. I do find that interesting because there seems to be elements of both behaviors in humans, but there's, I guess, a constant debate over, are we inherently, a positive species or are we inherently a warmongering species? And I think the argument can be made that only a small percentage of us are really facilitating the violence and the war, and most of us just want to live a happy, normal life. So I think you make a compelling argument with that.
Yeah, the kind of innate nature of man is sort of philosophical rather than scientific, and I go in and out depending on how crowded my bus is on the way home from work. But yeah, you do like to hope that, and it does sort of bear out in our kind of lived small live experience, that psychopaths just aren't that common. There's not that many of them, so hopefully we'll win in the end.
Yeah. So let's jump to Egypt a little bit. I mean, on your blog, one thing you wrote that I think sums it up pretty well is that even though mainstream Egyptologists won't budge on their official narrative, we're starting to reach a geological and archaeological understanding that the Egyptian civilization is substantially older than anyone thought and represents the final death rattle of something even older still. And I really like that. I think that's well put. Maybe you can elaborate on Egypt in this context of extending much further than we're told.
Well, I will. That's Egypt's a very good example for a number of reasons. The first is we can use it to kind of untangle some of the persistent ancient aliens beliefs that are associated with Sumeria as well, because the Egyptians have a similar kind of golden age that existed prior to dynastic Egypt, where they had the gods ruling the earth, and they ruled for very specific numbers of years. So very long numbers of years, sort of 36,000 years, or the Golden Age lasted for 432,000 years. You see these similar numbers, the 432, either 4,320,000 or 432,000 in the Vedas, and you see it in Sumeria, and you see similar numbers divided by precessional numbers, so 72, 36, and so on in Egypt as well. So what I think people have missed, and it's because Zechariah Sitchin was very literal about this. He saw these numbers, and so like whatever it is, the first king of Samaria, what's his name? Alulim. He ruled for 28,800 years. But that is divisible into this kind of master yuga number that we see elsewhere. Mm-hmm. So when he says that the gods came from the stars, they didn't. The gods were the stars. So what you're actually seeing at that earlier time depth is a kind of tribal story that's based on some sophisticated astronomy, and that's the key. But there's this tribal story of, well, this is when this god ruled, and by this god they mean this particular asterism when it was in this part of the sky, which it was for this many tens of thousands of years. So you're seeing a cultural memory that goes back not as far as these numbers, but definitely further back than we see, and with the capability of calculating these numbers, because the precession of the equinox is a 72,000 year kind of, or one every 72 year 1 degree move. So you're actually talking about very slow moves in the sky. Mm-hmm. And that sophisticated astronomical knowledge is there at the base of our earliest cultures of Harappa and Sumeria and Egypt, which begs the question of where, like, that doesn't mean spacemen taught them that. It means that they have an earlier cultural influence that is currently sort of outside archaeological view. Mm-hmm. So in Egypt's case, why I call it the sort of death rattle is that we sort of think of Egypt as this one time period. We go, no, ancient Egypt. It wasn't. It lasted for a very, very long time. So the gods like Isis was a prominent god for a lot longer than we've had Jesus. So we're talking really long time depths here. And the Old Kingdom, which is obviously the first one, the way we characterize Egyptian history, we split it into sort of three main areas: Old, Middle, and New Kingdom, and then you have the late period and then the Roman period and so on. And these are split up by what are called intermediate periods. So you have a first intermediate period between the Old and Middle Kingdom, and then a second intermediate period. Mm-hmm. And the first intermediate period wasn't a pleasant time to be in Egypt. It was 150 years of war and invasion, and things weren't great. Like it had its own George Bush Iraq situation going on. Mm-hmm. Now the Old Kingdom, just instantly, well, again, you have that kind of eye blink appearance of what were like monumental structures, monumental to the point where Flinders Petrie, when he first went to Egypt in the 1880s, 1860s, he's sort of the founder, 1880s, the founder of Egyptology. He went there as a crazy 27-year-old Victorian Englishman, rented a tomb for 2 years. Probably didn't cost him very much, like an empty tomb on the Giza Plateau, and did the first ever survey of like a proper architectural survey of the Great Pyramid. And at the time, it was still the tallest building on Earth. So that's only 150 years ago. So we have this kind of inexplicable level of complexity that then ends. And from the Middle Kingdom on, Egypt kind of looks like, you could make the case that it's like modern Britain. It's sort of rattling around in the remains of its former empire, mm-hmm. Because they had to pass all these laws. Like the kings would say things like, "Oh, I promise I won't reuse old monuments," and what have you. This was a civilization that was kind of adjusting to its new level. But the Old Kingdom was something else, and it has no real. Well, that's not true. I think I can quite convincingly point to the antecedents based on the genetic evidence of sheep and other kind of things. But you kind of have this split between the Old Kingdom and the rest of Egypt. And the Old Kingdom kind of emerges from the gloom of what we don't know about history, just there on the edge of the light about what we do. Yeah. And it emerges fully formed. And the first thing you notice about these Egyptians was when it came to the stars, they weren't fucking around. And that's very interesting.
Yeah. I think this is fascinating, and I loved this little arc in your blog. The way you kind of described the first intermediate period there is by saying that it was a period of invasions and social economic collapse, and the prevailing beliefs probably came from the ancient Egyptian equivalent to Alex Jones, which is funny because, of course, in times of collapse, in times of chaos, people get paranoid, and they look for the mouthpieces that kind of suit that feeling in the air. And I think that was, pretty interesting stuff. It's a pretty funny way to put that.
Well, it is, and you see from the sort of earliest parts of the Middle Kingdom that they're trying to piece together something that they forgot. It's like, come on, I used to know this. So you see changes in the way Osiris is depicted, and the whole general afterlife has sort of been quote unquote democratized. This is the first time you start to see in sarcophagi, including non-royal ones, that they're painted on the inside with the goddess Nut, and you see the emergence of the like the Assyrian weighing of the heart, that kind of afterlife process where Osiris works out whether you've been good or bad, like in a Santa capacity, the Jesus thing. And then you work out whether you get eaten by this crocodile monster or whether you get to go to the Western lands. And this is where we first start to see Osiris depicted as a mummified god. In the Old Kingdom, he was never depicted as that. And so you see them trying to piece together. And my analogy is bringing back to the first conversation we had, my analogy is to what happened to Christianity. In the Old Kingdom, you have a royal mystery tradition that has shamanic antecedents, and I'll come back onto that. So the kind of the pyramid and Giza area and the Hebsed festival and all the different ways they invoked or called on the gods was to give the king immortality in life. So they would connect with certain stars. So the imperishable stars, which are the ones that are circumpolar, and obviously Orion, which is Osiris, and so on. They would have these ceremonies that kind of in some way associated the king with the stars, and he got immortality. By the Middle Kingdom, they just had sort of turned Osiris into a god. And that's more or less what happened to Christianity, where you had a bunch of mystery traditions that didn't really click together very well, but were never designed to. They were designed to be this kind of personal spiritual experience, then kind of smushed into this one canon and then sort of spread out over the empire. So that's the kind of analogy to think, to kind of get your head around the differences in the sort of Egyptian gods between when they show up fully formed at the beginning of the Old Kingdom and how the Egyptians try to piece them together as they piece their country together at the beginning of the Middle Kingdom.
Now that's interesting, man. I think that's actually a great way to look at it, and probably more accurate than I've ever really heard described. There's been so much confusion and gray area to me with discerning what's of value in some of these ancient texts, and I love the parallels with Christianity too. It's like a complex game of telephone where they get too far away from the source material to really understand it properly. And you could say the same thing about Stitchen's interpretations and the resulting story. It's just kind of a weird thing we do, I guess.
Yeah, it's in each case, it sort of lacks the subtlety that I think such a long time period deserves. And until we can kind of resist singular explanations, which is what an Ancient Aliens TV show runs on, and the singular explanation is aliens, then we miss the more interesting stuff that is happening. And the more interesting thing that is happening in Egypt's case is that no one really has looked at it. No one has done a Jacques Vallée version of Zecharia Sitchin. There is something very interesting about the complexity of the earliest civilizations on Earth. The ones that were the best at astronomy, or the ones that were most focused on the stars, were also the most complex and the most sophisticated. So those two things go hand in hand together, which from a occult perspective is particularly interesting. What is it about projecting your consciousness into specific parts of the night sky, or aligning your entire cities and indeed country in the case of Egypt? Egypt is basically one star map. Like the Old Kingdom building project needs to be looked at from a Google Earth perspective because, again, they weren't fucking around. But what they were doing was building a map of heaven, like a mirror of the night sky. So the civilizations or early cultures that were the best at entangling their consciousness with the stars were the ones who ended up with the best quote-unquote high technology. That is my version of Ancient Aliens. I do not rule out, and in fact probably suspect, that process eventually, if you start kind of picking up that phone and dialing numbers at random, someone's going to pick up on the other end. And it doesn't necessarily need to mean aliens. When you're talking about this kind of non-physical consciousness effect of looking at and entangling with the stars, again, you're not in a singular explanation world. It's not like someone at Zeta Reticuli telepathically got the message from Egypt. It's weirder than that, and it says more about consciousness and what our role is in the wider universe. And until we look at it from that perspective, we sort of fail to appreciate the ritual complexity of, say, the Giza complex or the step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara.
Yeah, man, I agree. I think this is great. And in terms of the complexity of some of these structures, when you write about the Great Pyramids, you refer to them as a huge stellar immortality machine, which, of course, is a pretty wild way to put it, although it does jive with the picture you're painting. But what else kind of leads you to that conclusion? Are there any other logs we could add to that fire?
Well, it's the Orion correlation theory that Robert Bauval came up with in the 90s is very sound. So that is that the three pyramids of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure match the belt stars of Orion. And it's very sound not only because that is correct, and in fact, their kind of location, if you take the Nile as the Milky Way, matches, but he's kind of, because his background was, he spent his entire career doing engineering in the desert. Like he worked on construction sites in Dubai. He built, a bunch of Dubai and what have you. So he kind of knows what building in the desert is like. And you can kind of see additional correlations, like other parts of the asterism of Orion. There you also have obviously the quote unquote air shafts or star shafts in several of the pyramids pointing at specific constellations, and in fact just the extreme precision of the Great Pyramid, which could not have been replicated until probably the beginning of the 20th century in terms of its location on Earth and its directional alignment, is impossible. And also, like, what's the fucking point if there isn't a point? Like, that makes sense, right? Mm-hmm. Giza is particularly interesting because it wasn't just a fourth kingdom, a fourth dynasty, which is when allegedly the pyramids were built. They weren't, by the way. It wasn't just a fourth dynasty necropolis. It had been used all the way back into pre-dynastic times. Now, my suggestion is that the geology of the Giza plateaus is limestone. So as a result, you have a lot of caves and kind of voids in the area, obviously under the ground, because rainfall prior to the end of the Ice Age, you know how limestone works, right?
Yeah, more or less.
Yeah, so you have this cave complex, which is the kind of original, which we can surmise as one of the original ideas of what the afterlife was. And in fact, it's a good assumption because we see that kind of under the earth location for the afterlife in shamanic or traditional societies more specifically. So you have on the western side of the river where the sun sets, you have this cave complex. And so if you can go back, I mean, Egypt has been occupied for tens of thousands of years. So you can go back far enough to before they built any of this stuff. And already it has this between the worlds, afterworld component because it's effectively a map of the afterlife that is also kind of the afterlife in that very tribal way. And I think this is the key to explaining why some of the geological evidence, like the rainfall damage of the Sphinx, can go back so very far and then not really have too many other things in Egypt that are around at the same time. Because if it was always this afterlife component, if it was always this map of the afterlife, then you would start to see things like that. And that would explain why you have from Dynasty 1 and Dynasty 0, all kinds of like broken pottery and tomb detritus and all this kind of stuff. So basically all through the Old Kingdom, and actually, frankly, right up until the 200s, people were sort of throwing their dead loved ones into these tombs in Giza. So it's probably the world's oldest graveyard when you think about it. So there's something about the entire area that is afterlifey, and obviously Orion being Osiris, you have the afterlife component. If you look at the work of, say, Robert Temple, and in specifically the Sphinx Mystery and kind of Egyptian Dawn, the golden section and the sort of golden mean, the sort of Fibonacci numbers and that kind of thing are everywhere in Giza, like from the shadow of one pyramid onto the other and so on. And it's layered. And so this is how Egyptian magic worked. As I said, they weren't fucking around. They've built in this model of the afterlife, this map of the being that confers immortality, which is Orion. And then the idea, this sort of resurrection number, which is what the Fibonacci number is, obviously, it's kind of how flowers work and all that kind of thing. You start to see from a magician's angle what they were doing here. And they were building resurrection technology. And I don't mean spaceships, I mean it in a magical sense, that this was a space you would go to have that principal initiation rite, which is to become aware that you will survive death. And that's what the mystery traditions are about, to make sure that you wouldn't fear death. That's kind of how you become a shaman, like you go into into the spirit world and back. And that kind of process you see on a hyper sophisticated level with astronomical precision in the Old Kingdom. And so that's why, it's a star map, but it's not because they needed a map of the stars because they had a spaceship. They were building a ritual space to connect their consciousness with the stars.
Wow, man. Yeah, it almost seems like it could have been more of a mechanical shamanism versus like a chemically induced shamanism.
Well, funny, that's kind of more correct than you might think. The Great Pyramid is something of a guitar. It resonates. So the kind of the sort of king's chamber in the middle is it's almost free floating the way it was built. And people who've performed like concerts in there, they've been in the Grand Gallery going up to it. And actually, this is interesting. So it sounds better in the Grand Gallery if you play an instrument in the king's chamber. And we don't really know obviously how this works, but it's clearly by design. You clearly have built a ritual space. And in fact, the quote-unquote sarcophagus, it wasn't, but the perfectly smooth granite sarcophagus that's too big to fit in the door that's in the king's chamber used to ring like a bell. And when I say ring like a bell, some enterprising Victorian up until, like, they had a little hammer that was attached with a rope to it up until about, again, the 1880s, 1890s, and then some local Muslim thought this was, un-Muslim and cracked which you can see, like cracked the corner of the sarcophagus inside the Great Pyramid. So it doesn't do it anymore. It broke the resonant effects. But before that, you could hit it with this little hammer and it would tuning fork. And it's inside another thing that hums. So this isn't space technology. This is some serious magic. And we don't know how it worked.
Yeah, man. We talked recently about energetic effects of just big organs in cathedrals on the show. So I wonder if there's not elements of the same type of understanding in that. Yeah,
that's a question you want to put to Dr. Farrell.
Yeah, no kidding. Because
that's his area. But but the point is, the spaceship analogy doesn't work.
Yeah.
And that's a misread of the fact that it was very, very interested in the stars and very, very interested in using magic in some way that's associated with the stars. And you see those things there. You don't need... And also, just from a motive perspective, what kind of podunk steampunk gyrocopter aliens are kind of like putting through the sky from wherever to show up and say, "Build me a triangle of rocks"? Like, this is mental. Even back then, you'd be like, "You say you're a god? You're kind of shit, actually." What's going on? Yeah. So the whole thing doesn't work. It doesn't work in Sumeria. It's the same thing except made of clay, which is even more lame than granite and limestone. So. The high technology is not physical that we see in these cultures. It is a supremely sophisticated. It's the apotheosis of shamanism. Yeah. So you see its beginnings tens of thousands of years ago in the same kind of behavior that you would have had with shamanism. The same thing every night for 20,000 years. The only thing on television is the night sky. So you get pretty good at watching it. And then you start to watch it a little bit more, and there are names or dreams associated with different asterisms. And then so you start to speak to those asterisms. And some of them, will speak back. And I think that is one interpretation of how you have shamanic culture moving at different speeds. And in the Old Kingdom, I think for the pardon the pun, top of the pyramid, they got it right. If you were the king, you were going to live forever in the stars.
I like that, man. The only thing on television was the night sky. It's like Orion is the original Dick Van Dyke show.
Well, yeah, I mean, and if you think about, and I do think about this because obviously being Australian, I've been out in the desert, and actually, well, you probably had similar experiences in California, but to see the night sky in a low moisture atmosphere, which, by the way, the Ice Age was, because most of the water on Earth was locked up in chunks of ice, hence the name. So the sky was unbelievably clear, no light pollution, maybe 100,000 people, well, a bit more than that, maybe 1 million people on Earth, fairly well spread out. Can you, you wouldn't have even needed the mushrooms to trip on the night sky.
Yeah, man, that's pretty wild. And talk to us a little bit about Zep Tepi. I mean, what does that term exactly mean? I'm not sure everybody would be familiar with that term in particular. And you talk about how it was encoded on the Giza Plateau. Talk to us a little bit about that. What is Zep Tepi?
So Zep Tepi, it kind of, there's a little bit of Egyptological inside baseball here, which I won't go into, but Zep Tepi is the name for the first time. So when I was referring to the fact that the Egyptians believed that they were the descendants of, or that there was once in Egypt a golden age where the gods ruled for tens of thousands of years, that is Zep Tepi. So it's kind of like the unfallen state.
Gotcha.
You can see, and this is kind of, and I go in and out on this. I do think that some of the astronomical alignments that you see on the Giza Plateau point to an earlier time, like much earlier, which you would expect if it had been in continuous use as a kind of ritual map of the afterlife for that long. But I kind of go in and out on the idea, which was a sort of Graham Hancock-inspired one, that it's basically a map of 10,500 BC. And I go in and out of it because one of the cornerstone pieces is the belief that the Sphinx doesn't have its original head. It's this tiny, preposterous little lump, right?
Yeah, yeah.
The assumption was that it originally had a lion head. I think, and I got this idea from Robert Temple in The Sphinx Mystery, but I think he's correct. I think it was originally a dog head. I think that was originally... or an Anubis head, so a jack.
Interesting.
And if you actually look at the shape, if you said you had pets.
I do.
So if you look at how the Sphinx is sitting, like with its arched back and its paws right in front and its long, narrow body, you go, that, I mean, I don't have a dog at the moment, but I grew up with them. And I mean, oh my goodness, that is actually...
a dog body.
That is a dog body. And the other piece that... supports this, and I think it's very, very interesting, is that one of the surprising things that Egyptologists have noticed is that the pyramid texts, which are from the 5th dynasty, right? So first time they're written down is in the 5th dynasty. They think the pyramids at Giza were constructed in the 4th. There's no mention of Giza, which is surprising.
Yeah.
But there might be, because there is dozens of references to something called the Jackal Lake. And the Jackal Lake was where the son of the dead king would go to wash the canopic jars that had his viscera in them as part of the funeral process. He'd go to the Jackal Lake to wash them, and that was part of the things he had to do to ensure his father kind of went off into the Assyrian stars afterlife, or the imperishable stars afterlife, and he could legitimately be king. There's a very good case to be made that the ritual area, because they kind of have this almost redundant temple in front of the Sphinx, and there's this narrow passage in between it and the next door valley temple, and obviously the Nile came right up to these temples back in the day. So, and there appears to be evidence of like a sluice gate at the end of this corridor. So Robert Temple's suggestion, I think it's worth considering, is that you would actually be able to fill the Sphinx chamber. Because why would you build this beautiful structure, like carve it underground? Like you can't see it. Like they literally dug a pit and put a Sphinx in it. So it's basically sitting in the middle of a pool. And so I think so I go in and out on that. And that sort of supports my continuous afterlife map theory rather than this is a map of the first time for whatever reasons. I think following along that line, like the Dr. Shock line, where that all these structures around the world, not all of them, he's not an idiot, but the idea that these structures are encoded as some kind of warning for future generations, I don't think is very well supported. People don't care about kids. We can't stop having sex with them or eating them, and that's never not been the case in history. So the idea that we would kind of build these obscure warnings for some Americans in the 1990s to say, oh, maybe we should think about climate change. I'm not that convinced that happened.
Right. Yeah, me either. Now, to kind of transition, something you wrote that I love is, the Great Pyramid at least appears to be a stellar immortality machine, a blueprint that unpacks into a personal spaceship like George Jetson's briefcase. And I really love that visual, but you also use that George Jetson analogy in another piece describing panspermia, DNA, viruses, and the possible origins of life on Earth, which is another great topic that probably requires its own introduction. But how does one of these things give us clues into the other?
Well, yeah, you're referring to Mimi.
Right.
So Francis Crick, who discovered the double helix structure of DNA whilst on LSD, looked at it and looked at the possibility that it could have been randomly created from a bunch of amino acids randomly combining when they got hit by lightning on Earth as garbage, because it's sort of this many million mile code that's shaped like, well, the non-coding parts are shaped like a language. They follow Zipf's law. And he looked at it and said that didn't happen. So he, and this was his mainstream scientific theory, which, by the way, people kind of accept without realizing. And I mean, I'm talking Dawkins accepts this without realizing the implications of what it means. He invented this theory called directed panspermia. And the clue there is, I want to underline the word directed. And the general idea is that some form of complete DNA, and I think it was a virus, and he sort of speculated it was directed on a rock or whatever, like spat through space onto likely planets. And he underlined directed because there aren't that many planets. Like if it was a random attempt to fertilize planets, then our solar system would be filled with them, like pollen, because there aren't that many planets, even as far as we can see, that can support, that have the conditions that could support life. So he said it was directed. He didn't go any further than that. He didn't go by who. But that appears to be, from a sort of probabilistic perspective, the most likely origin of DNA. And then the next question becomes, well, then how? Like, in what form? You can't just write the word DNA on an asteroid and say good luck to you.
Nope.
There are a couple of them that I think are interesting, and I think a virus is one of them. And I think it was the 80s, in Bradford, England, they discovered a giant virus called Mimi. And it's this enormous, enormous virus that if we hadn't already built the rules about what is a living thing and what isn't a living thing, we may not have even classified it as a virus. It has this giant crystalline shape, like a virus, obviously, but it can do things. It can code for proteins, which a virus needs a host to do. So it basically has half the things that a virus needs from a host, but it can do things that a virus can do, like survive in space and lie dormant for ages. So in that respect, it's kind of like a terraforming ship, because it can sort of survive through space for perpetuity, assuming nothing hits it. And then when it lands somewhere, it unpacks like the proverbial George Jetson briefcase, and it starts to, like if it lands in the right kind of goo, or even if it doesn't, it could probably eat part of itself, but it starts to unpack. And that seems very, I'm not saying Mimi is the kind of origin of life. I'm just saying that we found one, and we find viruses when the rare times that we actually publicly spend money looking for viruses. we find loads of them. Like you find like 100 new viruses in a bucket of water in like the Caribbean Ocean. Like it's madness. They're everywhere.
Right.
But Mimi is kind of proof of concept that you can have a giant virus that behaves half like it's academic, literally, as to whether Mimi is a virus or not, because it can do things that viruses can't. And so you put that together with Francis Crick and directed Panspermia, and you sort of have 2/3 of what you need to start having what I would call a properly Sitchin-esque conversation, not a silly nuclear-powered rocket ship, space people building whatever conversation. You start to have a whole, hang on a minute, like, because we're talking about timelines that humans just can't think on. And we have these pieces and you go, that's interesting. Now we can start to speculate without saying the word Nephilim or whatever.
Right. I think that's a fascinating take on it. So if we're to consider that 2/3 of the puzzle, what's that final third?
The final third is what happened in the sort of several billion years between, well, the 1.3 billion years in between a hypothetical Mimi and us, and specifically what happened in the solar system. Because the other third of it is the story of our solar system, as we've discussed offline, is also not. There's a big question mark over a lot of that. And when it comes to modeling any hypothetical large impact on Mars from like an asteroid or what have you, which clearly happened, like half of it's sort of been ripped off. 4% of the ejecta would land on Earth. So you have a big thing hit Mars, 4% of its ejecta will hit Earth. When you combine that with the Mimi information, you are invited to speculate along another train of thought.
Right. Yeah, man. And I definitely love our talk offline, or I mean, our talk off air about the solar system and the strangeness of it. But the one more thing I wanted to say about Egypt in connection to panspermia and this DNA thing is because another wow moment I had was reading about your own wow moment, reading some of Robert Bauval's work. And to quote you some more, you said, "What rocked my world about Robert Bauval's article was learning that the word ben, the pointy bit on the obelisks and pyramids, is almost identical to the word for semen or seed, literal starseed. As Bauval continues to point out, is this what these statues are referencing? Did we build our own Mimi virus in the past?" I mean, damn, that is pretty heavy stuff, man. But I wonder if there is any possibility of that. Did the Egyptians direct their own form of panspermia elsewhere, and then as the society descended into chaos, people are still building giant obelisks referencing something that they don't understand, but it kind of is a symbol for a big dick jizzing into the sky.
Yeah.
Gotta say it.
Yeah. I did write that piece about penises, so that's all good. The starseed thing, I think, is very interesting because it gives us a glimpse into what the sort of, dare I say, kind of like initiatory belief system of the guys at the top was.
Yeah.
And it's further evidence that they're building these ritual structures as a way to kind of birth themselves in the stars, in specifically Orion and the circumpolar stars, which are associated with immortality, of course, because they never dip below the horizon. So you kind of, I think that folds into the idea that what these guys thought their eternal home was not on Earth. It was in some very specific stars. And I don't think they mean it in a Book of Mormon Scientology way. But nevertheless, that's because they probably didn't have... I mean, they did have a conception of planets because the circumference of the Earth is encoded in the Great Pyramid. So, but you can kind of accomplish that with some fairly, not boring, but like too difficult to go into mathematics of you basically need a ball of dung on a string on a hair, and you can kind of get from that with a bunch of other people. You don't need spaceships. You can get from that to like the circumference of the Earth. So I think they probably understood that they were on a planet. Where this gets interesting to me, and this is the speculation part or my interpretation, is that if you look to, say, the mid to late 20th century, when you have something like the Stargate project, where they're remote viewing Mars and the backside of the moon and seeing things. Now, these guys in the Old Kingdom were the best we have ever seen, and like there may have been something 300,000 years ago that was better. But in terms of what is available to us on the archaeological record, no one has topped these guys in this kind of ritual, astronomical consciousness manipulation. So if we can get a few people at the Stanford Research Institute to start seeing the rings of Saturn and other stuff around the solar system, can you imagine what the sort of peak of this very old culture would have done with unlimited resources and unlimited money, which they clearly had?
Yeah, man, it definitely makes you wonder. And it makes me think, if the spreading of life does happen in a Mimi virus type of way, I'm curious if they could have figured that out or where it came from, and we're trying to either get back to the origin of this traveling suitcase or open up a dialogue with it. Or, I mean, do you think that they could have even been trying to duplicate that process?
Well, maybe not that, but I think let's assume they did. I mean, they wouldn't have called it remote viewing and their protocols would have been different. But let's assume as these astronomer priests were meditating on the stars or different planets and they have a similar consciousness experience to the remote viewers who were seeing the Cydonia pyramids on Mars, for instance. These guys don't have a conception of DNA and they don't have a conception of combustion-powered spacecraft or any of those kind of things. So what they would see would be refracted through their culture. So I don't think they were looking for DNA. It's quite challenging to try to go, okay, well, let's match their experience. I think in some cases you can. I even think, and there's quite good academic research on this, that I even think the Hall of Osiris they're having similar near-death experiences because that's quite like the life review. So I think when we look at the consciousness experiences we have when we encounter things like remote viewing, we have to be aware that they would have been processed through a very specific cultural viewpoint. And I think this is the problem with when you get to, say, the Dogon and expecting them to go, oh, they knew about DNA. No, they didn't. But they may have been entangling with something that, if you can, like, think of the movie Contact, they may have been entangling with something that was delivering a similar message, but it's going to come through in a kind of North African tribe in a very, very different way to it coming through to Jodie Foster.
Right. So do you think that the plethora of ancient traditions and creation myths that involve vibrating space snakes could be crude attempts to kind of describe some of this, or maybe that was the interfacing?
It could be. I think the earliest evidence of ritual we have on Earth is to a giant python in Botswana 70,000 years ago.
Right.
So and that's the same time depth that we're talking about everyone who's now outside of Africa descending from Africa. So we have two kind of terrestrial interpretations that go along with it. One, it is our oldest god that we can see. So that's why it shows up in a bunch of places. It is also the ectopic phenomena that you experience or that you witness when you're going through some psychedelics, like high doses of psilocybin or obviously ayahuasca. You get the kind of diamond grid pattern and regular geometries. And then especially in ayahuasca's case, it morphs into a snake.
Right.
And I think that's what a lot of it is. Now, the question then becomes whether that snake is DNA or is our kind of consciousness expression of experiencing DNA can't really be answered. You can have an opinion on it, but it can't really be answered. So I sort of agree with what you're saying. I think we go snake is earliest god. Snake is probably earliest god because we can tie it to a ritual consciousness effect. But whether that consciousness effect is DNA is an opinion. Like it's one that you could probably, with a whole bunch of research and a whole bunch of friends on an island with a load of drugs, probably do like yeoman's work in uncovering, but we don't really have it now.
Yeah, and we'll have to add that to the to-do list. Also, on that subject, you sort of allude to having chemically or magically induced experiences that added to your insight into some of this stuff, into reality's blueprint. Have you had any personal experiences in this area that contributed to your thoughts on these subjects that you'd be willing to share or are worth sharing?
Most of them aren't worth sharing. They're like, you go in with best laid plans, but then you just kind of get off your face. I think, like, I haven't had, like, I don't have, well, if I did have revelations, I wouldn't trust them. So I think what I'm trying to say there is I can look at these experiences, or I can interpret some of the things like, again, the life review and the snake and the ectopic phenomena and go, well, based on my personal experiences of how these molecules work, I think that is a better interpretation than space snake.
Fair, fair. I might still be off here with this, but something I was thinking about reading through your work, it's kind of funny because conspiracy culture is very paranoid right now. We talked about times of economic upheaval and all these kind of things. It's very fitting that we would be a paranoid culture, but a lot of the conspiracy world is worried about transhumanism, and a lot of researchers are pointing out now that this is a crucial time where the elite are trying to become gods and create artificial intelligence and transcend life. That's a huge meme right now. And if you like looking at time secularly, could you say that there might be some parallels between this new element of the old kingdom of Egypt and maybe what the agendas of the pharaohs versus today's puppet masters, or not really?
Maybe not Egypt, but it's sort of, and it was a kind of, well, it wasn't mushrooms, but I was in a mildly altered state a couple of weekends ago. Do you know what terra preta is?
Terra preta, not familiar.
Okay, so it's basically a whole bunch of the North Amazon jungle appears to have been grown in artificial earth, as in somewhere like 15,000 years ago to 9,000 years ago, it wasn't as jungly as it is now. It was sort of grasslands.
Okay.
And you look it up. This is kind of that weird thing. And that interested me. So obviously someone was either, for agricultural reasons or whatever, parts of the Amazon are a side effect of someone terraforming Earth in their own way long ago. And so I was thinking, there was an article about a guy who is going to use drones to plant 1 million trees. I read that last week.
Wow.
That just got really Battlestar Galactica on me. And I thought, that's weird, because that's quite like terra preta. Like the guys whoever was using it for either improving the agricultural yield or whatever they were doing to kind of improve this soil, which is, it's artificial, right?
Yeah.
We're doing that again. Like, we are literally doing that again. We're using robots to plant trees. We don't know what that forest is going to be like in 10,000 years. So, like, in terms of an agenda perspective, they can have them. Like, the core premise of transhumanism is fundamentally wrong, which is that your personality is chemical, and so it can be chemically mapped with like quantum computing. Like, that's wrong. Okay, so they can go as far as they want down that path. They're actually never going to end up being billionaire software programs, downloading themselves into self-driving driving cars and then beaming themselves to Elon City on Mars. Like, that's literally not going to happen, because it's goo. It's like Howard Hughes, Spruce Goose, claptrap. However, the side effects of them chasing after this ludicrous dream are the same sort of side effects you see throughout history of people chasing after ludicrous dreams. They're unintended. Some of them are good, many of them are bad. So yeah, it's one to watch, but not because we're suddenly going to be faced with this all-powerful, glowing face of Bill Gates hovering above Seattle, demanding to be fed babies.
Fair points, man. Yeah, ain't nobody got time for that. And honestly, one of my favorite things to do is get stoned to the max and watch Planet Earth. I recommend it to anybody. And if you watch the ones about the Amazon, it really is another frickin' world, man. And to think that the reasoning for that is because it could have been ground zero for some crazy terraforming experiments in the ancient past, I'll never look at it the same. And I know that its climate plays a part, but to some extent, I always just kind of assumed that other areas weren't like the Amazon because of human development and cementing of our environments. But It is a pretty radically unique place.
Well, it is, and we think it's ancient. Like, we think it has that kind of that eternal feel to it. But it's basically somebody's garden. Well, parts of it, to be clear, somebody's garden that they've gone away and it's gotten away from them, and it's turned all Jumanji. So there's very little, and in fact, I think this was in Terence McKenna, but when he was looking at his kind of maybe mushrooms came from space thing, he was quoting some geologists and climatologists who said that they don't believe there's any such thing as a natural grassland on Earth. So wherever you find grasslands, it's because of human impact. And so the American Great Plains is a very good example, because they probably wouldn't be there if it hadn't been for the sort of large bovine animals that were managed by the First Nations people.
Wow.
And so the Amazon is one of those things. Like the story of Earth is not really one of us damaging a pristine ecology. We're certainly doing damage, but again, we're not the only game in town, and we weren't the first.
Yeah, and that is important to realize when you're kind of thinking about this stuff. But the things you've pointed out about the Mimi virus and DNA, Egypt, I mean, those are all things that I think are fascinating and also pretty new to me, a perspective I really haven't been all that familiar with. So it's good.
Nice one.
But I mean, Jesus, that pretty much runs the gamut of topics I was dying to ask you about. I know you do listen to the show, as you've mentioned. And
yeah, so I don't listen to in whatever it is in a few days' time on the bus. When I open up my phone and my podcast download, I'm going to be, Greg!
Gotta skip this one.
I want to listen to me.
Yeah, man. But it's just very unique to have a guest who also has that longer THC context. So I just think that's a really unique situation, and I'm glad that we kind of got to talk about some other shows because you know about those other shows. So that was pretty awesome, man. This is definitely one of my favorite episodes as of late. You're one of my favorite writers out there today. I know you do have some other projects in the works too. Some might be a little too early to mention, but maybe you can tell the people about what you got going on or where to get more, Gordon.
Yeah, well, runesoup.com, subscribe, there's the email sign up, what have you. So there's a couple of books coming out at some stage, probably in the late summer, the first one, which will be more in that kind of Egypt angle. But yes, all that kind of information will be there on the blog, so sign on up. And if you want to chat, I'm better on Twitter, because I don't use Facebook. So Gordon, Gordon _WHITE. And I presume, like last time, I'll hopefully chat to people in the comments on the forum.
Yeah, right on. Well, thanks again. It's been an absolute blast. Next time you make it to the States, you got to tell me where you'll be, and I'll definitely meet you anywhere to have a drink and maybe a smoke if you're down for that.
Anywhere.
All right, then. It's a deal. But until that day, take care of yourself out there, man.
See ya.
Rock you like a hurricane, people. There it is. I loved it. I think Gordon can sometimes be a good calibration tool for us when we get into the deep, dark depths of the conspiracy forest and could use a little lantern light to find the trail again. I'm curious how the audience will feel about this one because I think we looked into some really interesting data and information and sort of weighed it against some of the big conspiracy memes, which doesn't discredit them, but maybe transmutes them into a more scientific version of these ideas in some cases. I thought it ended up being a fairly unique show. I'm sure I'll see a lot of great comments, but I can also guarantee that just like every single episode, I'll get about 24 responses that say it's the best show I've ever done and their way of thinking is forever changed. And I'll also get about 24 that say it's the worst show they've ever heard. And I've just undone 5 years of building credibility on this show just to tear it down with a single episode. I'll hear both for sure, but I'm curious what the rest of the people think. Seems like Gordon's really done his homework and studying a lot of this stuff, in particular Egypt, and because of his chaos magic background, I think he comes out with some really interesting thoughts on old belief systems, and that's something that I remember him saying last time we did a show together, that a lot of people trying to study magic and conspiracy don't know enough about magic and end up making a lot of generalizations and coming to some poor conclusions. And I think that's valid. Now, if you only heard the first hour of this show, in the plus portion, we got way more into the strangeness of our environment, Gordon's thoughts on the moon, Saturn, and the perception of a flat planet. We also talked about how bloodlines of the elite and some non-human interdimensional influence could be added to the story. And we talked about some of the racial memes in the conspiracy world, mainly the Jewish thing. And I really liked that because Gordon and I talk time to time about some of this stuff, and I knew we could kind of get into the weeds without either of us getting offended or upset. And I think what was important for me to get across or have said was that a lot of the tools and techniques that people try to put on the Jewish elite solely. Things like using guilt against the opposition and fractional reserve banking dynasties, they're not exclusive to any race, religion, or culture. And when we let people act like they are, we're doing the elite a favor by moving the proverbial target away from them. Think about if you were a member of 100 powerful puppet masters and 30 of you were Jewish, and the people of the world only focused on those Jewish members. You'd probably feel pretty good. And you really wouldn't have a problem throwing fuel on that fire. It's not to say that some shady elite bankers aren't Jewish, but if we drop the Jewish and just say elite bankers, then we get them all. Because there are Chinese banking dynasties too that have ties to the triads, who are basically the Chinese Freemasons, etc., etc. So let's reject the temptation to reduce thousands of years of multifaceted manipulation into a 2 or 3 sentence narrative and instead enjoy the nuances of the vast and rich history we have to examine. But that said, next episode will be another Money Bomb winner, so get those contributions in the next, say, 48 hours. Of course, if it's after that, it'll just be in next month, so no real worries there. And if you are in the Money Bomb, please keep an eye on your email so I don't have to delay the last show of May. I will be going to Contact in the Desert, that conference out in Joshua Tree. Not in any working capacity, but I will be there. Feel free to stop me and say hello. I also did get most of the THC-themed covers up on the Plus site. Some I haven't even used for shows yet. Just click THC Music from the menu bar and right-click on them to save, if you're interested. Today's a particularly good one because I actually put Gordon's name in the lyrics that Lauren Silva sings. And that kind of does it for me, but I guess one thing I'd add to this episode, if you remember Gordon's comments about ancient Egyptians staring into the stars long enough, projecting thoughts into the stars long enough, and eventually some might start talking back. Now, of course, it's borderline impossible to separate one's imagination from an unexpected telepathic communication from a gas giant in space, but let me tell you a story. Almost exactly a year ago, I went on the Don Peyote movie premiere tour bus up and down the California coast with, of course, Dan Fogler, who wrote and directed the film, but also Freeman and Jamie and a few other folks. Ron Patton from Paranoia, yada yada. A lot of you probably remember that. Well, we ran into some friends of Freeman's on the trip, a very nice lady, her good friend and daughter, and after a while, it was disclosed that they were all on acid, and I had never done acid before, and I had a weird anxiety on that trip that I was going to be interfacing with some psychedelic somewhere, and here it was. Funny enough, the universe wrapped this LSD in the most perfect, non-threatening package that it could for me. These 3 nice ladies that all seemed to be doing just fine with it. So how could I say no? So long story short, they hit me with a few drops, and 30 minutes later, I tell them I don't really feel anything, so they give me another couple drops. This is like a liquid LSD that's in, say, something like a Clear Eyes bottle. So now I've been hit with about 4 or 5 drops of this stuff, and eventually it all comes rushing to the surface, and Jesus Christ, I was on a very serious ride in the middle of the redwoods of Big Sur with nobody that I'm all that familiar with, and it lasted a long time. When everybody was winding down and I'm laying in a sleeping bag on the floor of a dirty bus with my head hanging out the open door along the cliffside of the ocean, wide awake, like I just drank 5 psychedelic Red Bulls, I find myself staring at the brightest star in the night sky and trying to sort of talk myself out of tripping so damn hard. And like I said, it's almost impossible to separate one's imagination from a telepathic conversation, but I swear to you, nothing like this could have ever felt more real. But this star does start talking back, and we have a good laugh about my present state, and this star proceeds to give me its life story. And imagine the 10-minute fast-forwarded version of a 10 billion year lifespan, complete with the formation of planets and the rises and falls of their civilizations, and asteroid impacts, and everything one might expect in a star's personal journey. And I just sat there like, wow, that's pretty amazing, man. And the star was like, yeah, it's great, but how about you, man? You know, how cool is it just to experience the wind and the fresh air and the smell of cedar and the crash of the waves against the rocks? I can't feel that. I can't see that. That's why even though life as a badass yellow dwarf is cool, I ain't knocking it. There's also some great benefits from manifesting as a human being in Big Sur who did a little too much LSD. And I thought, touche, star. And although that whole story probably means nothing, as high as I was, I will never forget how that felt, and the impression I was left with that to beings that are ultimately consciousness, having an experience in the shell of a human being or a yellow dwarf star, both sort of have their ups and downs. And upon their inevitable demises, both can ultimately be summed up as, that was cool. And that's a beautiful thing. And that's it. I've done my part. Your move, Eternal Pharaohs of the Orion Nebula. Your frickin' move.
Carwood, it's your show now. So what's it gonna be? 'Cause people will tune in to hear another new conspiracy. Almost too much of. We thought this was low. It's bad, getting worse. So where'd all the good people go? They're on the Higherside chats 'cause it's everybody's favorite show. Where'd all the good people go? He got Jamar's gold and white, and then there's Crow. They talk this and that on the